The multi-words in my title, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multireligious, illustrate the complexity of the context where Bible translation is taking place. I add secondarily multimodal and multisectoral, which will come up in this paper. The complex contexts we engage today require critical analysis from multiple perspectives and disciplines. Many of the contexts where Bible translation is being initiated are under significant cultural and economic pressure or stress. In an already stressed environment, whenever energy and resources are mobilized for translational action, that translational action has the potential to exacerbate old wounds or contribute to healing processes. The case study in this paper addresses ethnic and tribal conflict as a social wound. In keeping with the conference theme on quality in Bible translation, I ask, how can biblical narratives and other genres be translated hermeneutically and theologically in a manner that contributes to social healing, especially given the high amounts of cultural and economic pressure contemporary Bible translation contexts are experiencing? At each biennial conference since the Bible Translation 2015 conference, I've presented on the contextual Bible study method as a form of community-based translation for personal and social transformation. CBS, Contextual Bible Study, is a useful method for Bible translators to help them learn how to translate biblical texts with a variety of sectors in their community. CBS, as you can see, uses the See, Judge, Act method to read, reread, to translate and retranslate biblical texts in a manner that is critical, dialogical, and iterative. CBS teaches group Bible study processes so that Bible translators can learn to engage subgroups in their multilingual, multiethnic, and multireligious communities, to translate biblical texts with them, privileging different groups' sectoral perspectives in the translation process. My goal is to help translators learn how to facilitate multi-sectoral translational dialogue in their communities. Theologically, as a method, contextual Bible study seeks to work with the God of life, John 10:10, who is actively working with people to translate biblical texts for personal and social life transformation. The first step of the See, Judge, Act method is to see a relevant theme or issue in the local context. The CBS method encourages people to see and analyze social problems critically, foregrounding the structural and systemic aspects of the issue being studied, and then to prioritize the perspectives of those individuals and groups experiencing pain because of that social issue. Then CBS encourages the groups to judge their social problems by asking questions that prompt translator participants to slowly and carefully read, reread, translate, and retranslate a biblical text with others, searching for life-giving detail in the text that can be appropriated into their individual and collective bodies. And then in the act phase of the study, participants translate the Bible into action, to borrow a word from Margaret Hill and Harriet Hill. And then I would add to translate into action for the purpose of life and life more abundantly. I want to touch briefly on a couple of theoretical perspectives that help me see the multi-factors involved in ethnic and tribal conflict more clearly. One of the scholars that helped me to see the systemic causes that fuel contemporary ethnic conflict in Africa is Mahmoud Mamdani. Mamdani illustrates or distinguishes between ethnic groups and tribes. During colonization, ethnic groups were transformed into, quote, administrative political units known as tribes, end quote. Tribes and tribal lands were clarified by colonial interventions including specific acts of colonial translation to make them easier to rule with clearer hierarchies, clearer boundaries, flattened customary law, all backed by colonial firepower. Mamdani's analysis of the colonial making of tribes has helped me to interpret aspects of conflict that I experienced in northern Ghana, which may be applicable to Bible translation projects more generally. The second theoretical perspective that helps me see contextual dynamics more clearly is Achille Mbembe's notion of entangled time. My Bible Translation 2019 paper engages Mbembe's notion of the entanglement of time, discussing pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial time. I have expanded Mbembe's concept of the entanglement of time to include differently entangled spaces and differently entangled social bodies. By valuing and honoring different groups in our communities, I hope to lift up the unique gifts and perspectives that groups and individuals bring to the Bible translation process. I have witnessed how these perspectives uncover dynamics that are lying there in the biblical text, dynamics that are relevant for contemporary translation. Drawing on Mbembe's notion of entanglement, I have observed three entangled contexts and groups of people that come together in most Bible translation projects. One entangled context is the post-colonial church, which frequently encompasses differently colonized urban and rural locales. A second entangled context are the local communities where Bible translation occurs. The third entangled context are the international agencies that support Bible translation. In my previous Bible translation conference papers, I have used contextual Bible study to engage local Bible translators and local community groups. I have engaged with local church leaders, but I have not overtly engaged higher level church leadership, theologians, or scholars. This is an ongoing interest for future papers. But what about my own social perspective? What about the North American agents of Bible translation and Christian missions? My case study uses the contextual Bible study method to engage with Lutheran North Americans who have worked or are currently working in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the USA, in Bible translation or English as a second language ministries. My goals in this case study are first to use contextual Bible study to encourage North Americans to employ critical thinking in the way they see the context they engage in Christian mission and Bible translation, and to do the same in the way they read, interpret, and translate Genesis 14 and other biblical texts. Third, I want this contextual Bible study to encourage North American agents to more overtly focus their translational action so that it intentionally contributes to social healing from tribal conflict. One way this can be done is by facilitating multi-sectoral translational dialogue for social healing. I chose Genesis 14 because of the complex way it navigates inter and intra-ethnic conflict. There are surprising ethnic alliances. This text, there are political manipulations happening. There are surprising and strange interreligious dynamics around the character of Melchizedek. Genesis 14 is set in a pre-imperial time, prior to Israelite entanglements with the Babylonian and Persian imperial empires. But I agree with many scholars that the ancient version of Genesis 14 in the Masoretic text or in the Septuagint were traditioned texts, and thus Genesis 14 in its final form comes from a later time in the Persian imperial period, and it critiques Persian imperial politics. Could be that this is a subversive text. The conflictual dynamics at work in this text are dangerous. At the end of this contextual Bible study, one participant issued a strong caution against studying this text or translating this text or focusing on this text in a context where Christians are actively involved and tempted to be involved in tribal conflict. Similarly, the Old Testament scholar Norman Gottwald has cautioned that it is, quote, risky business to unearth social symbols from the past that may have links that are dangerous or even toxic for today. Therefore, is it not especially important for dangerous texts to be translated, interpreted critically, dialogically, and from many sectoral points of view for social healing? The theme of this contextual Bible study is engaging multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multi-religious communities that are. Along the way, I will pause to observe some more multimodal and multi-sectoral aspects that emerge in this study. And I have issued a handout on the Whova app. You can download this study. The first question for contextual Bible study is, what is this text about? Participants answer this question using their initial hermeneutical understandings of the text. This is how Bible translators also work. We make meaning out of a biblical text, drawing on the theological and hermeneutical themes we have. The North American participant translators drew out theological themes such as they saw this text as a rescue mission or as illustrating God's promise to Abraham. Another saw it as teaching Abraham to trust in the Most High God, or illustrating the capacity for human good and human evil, and more. The second question oriented North American participant translators to the crux of the conflict in this text. I asked them to graphically illustrate their understanding of the conflict between 5 local kings in battle and 4 invading kings. This question prompts translators to overtly engage in multimodal translation. One of the important findings of this study is that different groups use different translational strategies to produce their illustrated semiotic translations. Several groups wanted to do their own socio-historical and geographic research. They used their phones and other study tools to research biblical maps. They imagined what route the kings from the north and east took to invade the land of Israel. This translational strategy required a significant amount of research and expertise, privileging ancient geography and map reading skills in their semiotic translation over other elements in the text. Another group took a different strategy, focusing more on the material realities of ancient travel and ancient warfare in addition to geography. By focusing on the ancient waterways that come up from the south, this group suggested that the 4 kings could have come, instead of coming across from the north and east, they might have come up from the south. This group imagined ancient warfare between cavalry and infantry, and further hypothesized that in order to have won the initial battle, the invading kings must have had local allies aiding them as they navigated the salt flats in the southern areas. Take a look at this picture. Here's the third group's illustration. This group said that the ancient geography was not too important to them, but they recognized that it was important to the ancient writer. The advantage of their approach was that they were able to focus on the textual detail, and in a relatively short amount of time, they produced a graphic illustration of the conflict in the text. This graphic was appropriate, useful, and accessible to them, and potentially even to a broader audience. This is another third translation strategy. Moving then to questions 3 through 5. My intention here was to invite participants to see that Abram had an allyship that they might not expect. One group identified the character of Mamre as a person, as an Amorite. Others focused on the brothers of Mamre, Eshol and Aner. The important thing is, these characters were not Israelites in the ancient setting. Abram is depicted as operating in a multi-ethnic context. The 318 men that were said to be born in Abraham's household raises a question about the size of Abraham's house. Were all these his direct relatives? What does that say about ethnicity? Another group realized that some of the place names in this text, like Dan and Damascus, come from a later time in Israel's history. So each of these groups, in their own way, were practicing critical thinking, which is one of the goals for this study. Question 6 focuses on Melchizedek. Some groups focused on the details of bread and wine in the story, as you might expect from a group of Lutherans who take the sacrament frequently. Another participant drew out sociocultural knowledge from the Middle East regarding ancient practices of cutting a covenant in which bread and wine were used as part of the gifts that were exchanged. Question 7 contrasts Abram's response to Melchizedek with his response to the king of Sodom. This question is meant to focus participants on manipulation in ethnic and tribal conflict. Questions 8 to 10 turn the group toward thinking about how to draw resources from this text to their own contemporary multilingual, multiethnic, multireligious, and conflict-ridden contexts of today. We were only able to touch on these questions because of time. Rather, let's move to the evaluation of the study. One participant remarked that the complexity and confusion that they felt reading this unfamiliar text of Genesis 14 mirrored what it might be like for people who read the Bible in Bible translation contexts. For those of us who enjoy reading the Bible a lot, it is good for us to be reminded just how much cognitive work new translators and translation audiences have to do to achieve a semblance of understanding. I already mentioned the concerns of participants who feared studying this text with Christians in active tribal conflicts might encourage them to kind of mimic Abram's action so that they would be justified in participating in Christian violence. Perhaps in response to the suggestion that we might not want to engage Genesis 14, another participant reminded the group to judge Abram's actions in Genesis 14 in light of Abram's call to be a blessing to all families of the earth in Genesis 12:3. Drawing on this notion of being a blessing to all families and nations of the earth, someone asked, where is Jesus in all of this? Does Jesus show up in this text? A discussion then ensued, returning to the previous questions about the interactions between Abram and Melchizedek and the biblical theology of Melchizedek in Psalm 110 and Hebrews. I then interjected one theological and methodological contribution to this discussion. One of the commitments of contextual Bible study is to read the Bible with pain bearers in the community. That is, people who bear social and physical pain related to the study's theme, which for this study is ethnic conflict. I suggested that one strategy to discern where Jesus is in this text for North American mission agents would be to ask, who are the pain bearers in our communities, in our contexts where ethnic and tribal conflict is taking place? Perhaps it is only by reading and translating with people who have been victims of ethnic and tribal conflict, and by listening to how they tentatively read, translate, and eventually interpret this text in dialogue with other social sectors in their community, that Jesus will show up in entangled time and space with potential remedies for violence and pain that has been done and is being done through our world's violent policies and practices. There's a clear danger in reading texts of ethnic violence with victims of tribal violence, because doing so can re-traumatize people. Such a task is not to be undertaken quickly or without a trauma-informed approach. Conclusions. What were the results of studying this text with North American agents of Bible translation and ESL ministry? After 2 hours, they wanted to keep going. This suggests they had a good time and were enjoying the process. Usually we take 3 hours for contextual Bible studies. Some of them said this process was life-giving for them. I have shown how this process increased the critical analysis of the context and the text from these participants. However, Not as much work was done on deconstructing the way North American cross-cultural agents think of ethnicity and tribe as I had hoped. I wonder if all that illustration about the multimodal translation on Genesis 14 could be leveraged so groups could experiment with different translational strategies and styles that are open to them. CBS is different from other hermeneutical and translation processes. One of the ways it is different is that contextual Bible study makes a group's translational life interests overt rather than keeping them covert. I suggest that all hermeneutic and translation processes involve people's real life interests. The difference is making them overt rather than keeping them hidden in the background. Secondly, CBS or contextual Bible study is careful about which biblical texts communities engage, and suggests that potentially dangerous biblical texts should be engaged for life-giving and emancipatory purposes, rather than leaving communities to struggle on their own with the ideo-theologies of death that are at work around them. Moreover, contextual Bible study is and should be facilitated in a way that values each individual and group contribution. This practice is inclusive and it facilitates dialogue. In many ways, artful facilitation across social sectors is a kind of group translation process. While this contextual Bible study was life-giving for these North American translator participants, singular experiences are not enough to facilitate lasting change in a social context or in a method being used. Experiences like these need to be connected to a larger project of translating for multi-sectoral engagement, multi-sectoral dialogue, and social healing. And at some point in the process, privileging the translations and interpretations of people and groups who are pain bearers in relation to the social themes relevant to our entangled contexts.